iHeartRadio presents Podversations, a weekly discussion with the biggest names and influencers in podcasting.
Hey, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for another edition of the iHeartPodcast webinar speaker series. As any of you who have showed up to these in the past know, we started this about two and a half years ago, right at the top of quarantine, when we saw a lot of our friends and colleagues and peers being a little bit more disconnected from each other than usual. And we wanted to stay connected. And our excuse for doing that was to talk about one of our favorite new mediums, podcasting. Podcasts have exploded into the media landscape over the last 5-10 years, especially the last 2 or 3 years. And so these became really rich, awesome weekly conversations for us, where we get to talk to creators about what drives them, how they got started, and yes, why podcasting is a big part of their lives. This week is a pretty special edition for me because I get to talk to someone who we really, really admire, one of our own, Jason English. Jason, first of all, thank you so much for hanging out today, man.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
I don't know, I'd call it an honor, but we'll check in a half hour. We'll see how it goes. So you came to iHeart a few years ago to take on, yes, executive producing some podcasts for us, but specifically to launch a slate of shows that we dubbed iHeart Originals. And before we get into sort of your background and where you came from originally and what you did before this and what got you into this whole content game and all that good stuff, what is the iHeart Originals slate? What was the spirit of it at the outset?
The iHeart Originals are a series of limited run 8, 10, 12 episode podcasts, all self-contained. I like to think of them like old glossy magazine feature stories where you do a super deep dive on a topic, and a topic that maybe isn't in the news, isn't relevant to everyone, isn't also being discussed elsewhere. And people get into it, and then all of a sudden it's the story they want to share with all their friends about the weird things they're learning. And so we hit lots of different topics. You put the shows we've launched next to each other. There are a lot of commonalities, but they might not be as obvious because we're just trying to pick great topics that we think people will want to spend 10 episodes with. The question of what's a good 1 episode topic versus what's worthy of 12 is something we go up against every day. And so we found some good ones that in our heads at least are worth the deeper exploration, and got a lot more exciting ones coming later this year.
So through this effort, you've managed to create a slate of shows that are certainly some of the best work we've done, period, as a podcast network, but also some of the biggest podcasts of the last 2 years in the entire industry. Shows like of late, What Happened to Sandy Beale, but beyond that, shows like Big Brother, Autism's First Child. I want to drill in on something you just said. What is that filter that makes a light go off in your head that's like, oh, this is not just 1 episode, this is 12 episodes. I will consider this very seriously as an iHeart original. What is that trigger?
We have something called the Snapple fact test, where I can tell you something and you can say, wow, that's really cool. Tell me more about it. And for a lot of things, that Snapple fact distillation is the best version of that, because then you dig in and it's not really as interesting or layered, or there aren't that many people. So what we try to do is find something that works as a Snapple fact. So 1 in 4 cowboys in the Wild West and the frontier days were Black. That's interesting. Let's go deeper. And so we work with, on that one, Black cowboys, Aaron Burnett, have these great stories of some of these individuals and their life stories, and brought it to life in a great way. There's a story about Bruce Willis, the actor in the 90s, bought up a town in Idaho. Like, okay, well, that's interesting. Let's go meet some of the people in the town who he interacted with, and let's tell their stories. And when you're able to then have lots of these little branches off of the Snapple fact, that's what makes the series work. And that's what we look for. So if we get into something and realize we don't have enough branches, or the branches we have don't feel like episodes that people would actually care about, that's when we have to decide we like the Snapple fact too much, but we're going to leave it in the bottle cap and move on to something else.
And there's just a couple things that triggered for me. Was back to Black Cowboys, this incredible podcast. I think might have been the first of the iHeart originals.
That was the debut. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're right about layers. Like, I understand when you say, yes, the stat kicked us off 1-4, but then you get this host in Zarin who just did an amazing job telling those stories. But then there was a layer even deeper, which was his relationship with his dad.
Right.
And his dad used to tell him these stories about Black Cowboys in order to almost like reclaim ownership of the Wild West. And do those sort of archaeological dig layers, is that the moment when, as a producer, you're like, I've struck gold? Didn't mean to necessarily, but here we are. What's that moment like?
Oh, absolutely. And Zarin is a great example. Just such a talented guy who has gone on to launch lots of cool stuff with iHeart and more to come. But that's exactly it. On the page, these stories of the Cowboys would be great. If the audiobook version is just those stories, but it's not an audiobook. How do you differentiate this? Like, why is this in audio versus on the page or being read from a book? And that's a great example of Zarin and his dad had this incredible chemistry. Obviously, Zarin's dad, we should have shows for him. He should be hosting something year round. He's such a talented, interesting guy on his own. But looking for those things, we did a show called Operation Midnight Climax. Again, starts with a Snapple fact. The CIA ran a brothel during the Cold War, and they were using it. They had the sex workers on the payroll. They are experimenting on people in an effort to win the Cold War. These experiments were vital in the 50s and 60s. To get that from a host reading about it, you can interview experts on that, but everyone is generations removed now from the participants. We found a hero at Stanford. This is very much in lockdown, who dug up the unpublished autobiography of one of the CIA agents who we talked about. So all of a sudden now we have him in his own words, and hundreds of letters that he wrote and diary entries. So now we can make him a character. We can bring in a voice actor. So it's not just the host, in that case, Noel Brown, an incredible iHeart podcaster, producer, and host of that one for us, and have Noel paired with the guy from history in his own words.
I think you joined iHeart 2020. Is that right? About two and a half years ago?
That's the first lockdown.
That's what I was going to ask. That's what I was going to ask. So on a personal level, you enter into an audio company right or toward the beginning of quarantine. And podcasting flourished across quarantine. It continued to grow. Listenership continued to grow. We're at 120, 130 million Americans a month now listening to podcasts. If you look at that trajectory across the last couple of years, it hasn't slowed. But what was it like personally to join a big podcast network with a lot of momentum and dig in on a hard assignment? I want to tell the absolute best stories in this medium for the biggest network. I'm just interested, how did that go?
I am incredibly fortunate that the iHeart New York and Atlanta and LA teams embraced this and dove in, and people like Ryan Murdoch and Julian Weller and Aaron Kaufman and all these people who worked on these early shows, who, we were all locked down. We never met. This was all on Zoom like this, and just managed to, because they were a force of talent and we're excited to work on some of these projects and and tell these stories, that they came out the way they did. I mean, I think I don't know what the version of the show would have been had we all been in conference rooms every day coming. I mean, there's something to be said for us being able to go away and work in our own heads in our own time, and then come back, and it was exciting to hear every cut, every new interview, and so it just kind of cascaded from there, where we finished the first show, the second show was already in production, the third and fourth shows were in production, and being able to work with some of these incredibly talented folks across the company on different shows, it's been an education for me, and the highlight of my career to get to have these mini all-star teams working on these different shows and learning from everybody, and trying to, put my stamp on what I like. When I talk about the commonality between the shows, I do love audiobooks. I try to listen to 50 audiobooks a year. So if the information is good, I'm okay with that. It's dry and there's no scoring, and I walk away at the end of it and feel like, okay, I'm smarter now. I can talk about this topic and feel like I've learned something. We want to get that feeling, but score it like a movie, make you feel like you're in this immersive experience. You're in the Old West, you're in San Francisco in the 50s, you're in Isaac Newton's lab or Bruce Willis's Idaho, and really get you sucked into that world for 8, 10, 12 episodes in a way that an audiobook can't do, and doesn't even attempt to. So it's the best of two different audio formats we try to put together as one.
It's a really cool way to think about it, about how a book just pulls you in across months and months and months and months sometimes into a world. A podcast is a little more of a quick turn, but yeah, I get that. I get how you're sort of operating somewhere in between, where it's got the depth and archaeological dig, again, layers of a book, but with this sort of on-demand nature of podcasting. Before iHeart, you mentioned sort of your guideposts, as it were, was like, well, let's do this sort of glossy magazine version of a podcast. You worked at a magazine called Mental Floss. It began as a print product. It evolved into a website. Coincidentally, maybe not, the COO of the iHeartPodcast network is Will Pearson, who was one of the founders of Mental Floss. What did you do at Mental Floss? How long had you been there? And tell us a little bit about that company. It was a very special company with very special group of creators there doing very cool stuff very earlier than others in terms of innovating for digital, especially. What was it like?
It was a great education. I was there for 13 years, which is like 4 or 5 lifetimes in digital, in media, it seems like. And I had been working as a copywriter in New York at J. Walter Thompson, and just wanted to do some other writing on the side. And so I was pitching and writing freelance things. And one of the places that picked up some stuff was Mental Floss. It happened to be at a good time, 2006. And they said, we're starting this website. You have any interest in writing some stuff on your commute, on your lunch break, on your weekends? And absolutely, like, I just thought this can be the most interesting part of my life, and I can have this day job that I also liked, but wasn't maybe as creatively rewarding as I was hoping, and just got in at the best possible time to kind of grow up with the internet. Before really Twitter and Facebook were the forces that they would become, and YouTube was just starting, and just on a daily basis trying to figure out, what do people want from Mental Floss or a media brand? How do we keep these people who previously we were just, every other month the magazine would come out? How do we stay relevant to them in the interim? And then the interim just kept getting smaller, and it wasn't, we need something every week. It was, we needed something every day. We need multiple things a day. We need a tweet every 15 minutes, and trying to stay true to, we need to make these things interesting, at least, because it's so easy to stop reading, to stop following, to just kind of wander away. And so trying to keep that high bar of we want people to share this, not in the social media sense. We wanted that too, but give people stuff that is so weird and interesting and fascinating that they would want to tell someone else. So there's definitely that core of that has been baked in for my career ever since, and trying to strive for that, where when you describe what's your podcast about, being able to do it in that one line that makes someone say like, wow, I can't believe that is a podcast, that happened, that, you know, all those things, and try to entertain people that way. So I ran the gamut from freelance writer to associate editor to managing editor, then spent 7 years as editor in chief and chief content officer. So I kind of got to grow up with the company as well, and learned a lot of random facts over the years. So if I can put some of them to good use in some of these shows, then that's a bonus. I was also a history major, which at the time did not seem like a great idea, I guess. And also able to lean on that in a way that I did not see coming when I graduated college many years ago.
You know, what dawns on me is so much of the iHeartPodcast staff, a lot of folks who work here came from or were influenced by two companies. Mental Floss was one. You, Will Pearson, are good examples of that. HowStuffWorks.com was the other. Obviously, that's where Stuff Media was born out of that website. And it's really interesting as I sort of put this together out loud in real time here for the first time, how these two media companies, albeit small, but very unique in their own ways, I think create a bit of a bedrock for the iHeart Podcast Network that today still rings true. And what they maybe share a little bit in common is Mental Floss and How Stuff Works both had a bit of an unspoken mission, I think, of finding the amazing in the very mundane. I think Mental Floss did it in a cleverer way. How Stuff Works did it in a more basic way, long form articles about everything and anything. But it's really interesting to have that origin story in a weird way behind this network. When you think about where stuff comes from, I always ask this question when we have guests on. At some point in your life, I imagine early, maybe you became really interested in odd, esoteric, strange things, where those things came from, what made them tick. What is your own sort of origin story around that? What inspired you to think that way, to think differently maybe than your peers, to be a little bit of a storyteller? Where did that come from?
Probably before I ever got into anything resembling this kind of work, came from my dad just being a guy who knew a lot about a lot of things and could hit you with some random fact, and it might have been the only thing he knew about whatever topic it was, and it'd just be like, okay, and that would stick with you. And then kind of unconsciously, when I'm reading, just storing stuff away myself, like, maybe I can drop this into conversation later. Maybe 15 years from now, it can become a podcast that we're going to launch later this year. So when we actually started doing this in practice, I think one thing both of those companies have in common, we weren't news organizations. So the mission wasn't, we're going to tell you what's happening, we're going to help you have a deeper understanding of the news, we're going to have everything tied to the news. It was, hey, there are 1,000 companies doing that right now. Why don't we try to find interesting stuff and talk about that? And sometimes that seems kind of weird. Like, why are you telling this story in 2022? That's a fair point. For a lot of the stuff I bring up, that's probably someone's gonna think that, and they're probably right to question it. But when everybody is trying to fill this space with different slants on the news and different ways in and different analysis, sometimes you have this lane all to yourself. And so when you can come out with totally, seemingly out of nowhere, but really out of months of research and months of development and interviews and writing, and what you do over here can turn a lot of heads in this crowd over here. So that's what we're gonna hope to continue doing with these shows for as long as you let us keep doing them.
Similar sort of, I don't know, origin story or inspiration for me. When I was young, watching my dad, it was almost a power that he could wield, where he would tell stories to a sort of enraptured room. And seeing the power of a story well told, it was a hackneyed term, but seeing it in practice was really, really impressive to me. And maybe there's something similar where you saw your dad drop these seeming trivial, harmless factoids, but it really is a sort of a power you wield to be able to grab someone's attention and keep it. What's coming up? So you have amazing stuff in the pipeline. You always do. It's one of our favorite things is to check out what Jason has lined up. You have a show called Stealing Superman, History of MySpace, The Pledge, Stealing Superman. Somebody stole a comic book from Nick Cage's house. What happened?
Yeah, I think I'd be open to any story that starts with a robbery at Nick Cage's house in 1999. So we get a comic book heist, not just any comic book, but Superman #1, one of the most valuable comics ever, and a 12-year hunt to figure out who took it. And we have investigators who don't care at all about comic books, but have to immerse themselves in the comic book world. And we have comic book experts, enthusiasts, nerds who are forced to learn the investigative ways. And so we have this long journey and end up solving. We don't solve the case. The case is solved. So we have a nice conclusion to this one, but we have 12 years of Nick Cage in between. So I think people are going to like that one. We call that our spiritual sequel to the Hollywood. A lot of the same team working on it. Not the stories aren't very similar, but it's a very well-known person in a very odd situation and trying to figure out how the person has almost a gravitational pull that impacts everyone around them in the story. And so I'm very excited for that one. We've got the history of MySpace, which is a kind of forgotten blip in history, but really a lot of the things that would later, the internet would grow up. You can see a lot of the seeds of that in these few years at this company that really had no business being the biggest social network in the world at the time. And you'll meet a lot of people with very peculiar MySpace stories in their own lives. So we're hoping to deliver a good company story, as well as a lot of great characters, whether it's people who were serving in the war in Afghanistan and being told that they were committing war crimes by posting on their MySpace page, because it gets wild. So we're excited about that one. We're developing a show about the origin of the Pledge of Allegiance and the team who this is a magazine story, a magazine in the late 1800s, and there's a need to make money, and their plan is we're going to sell flags to schools. And how are we going to sell flags to schools? We're going to make sure that there's a pledge that all the kids are going to recite every morning. So you'll get some American history. There's a Tommy Boy element, like a buddy comedy of these guys going on the road to sell flags across the country around the turn of the 20th century. So that should be a good one too. And at all times we're just looking for those Snapple facts and then digging in to see what else is here. How interesting is this going to be? And been pleasantly surprised so far.
Incredible pipeline of stuff, man. I cannot urge our viewers today strongly enough to go stop everything later today and go listen to What Happened to Sandy Beale, and then look out for these next three shows: Stealing Superman, History of MySpace, and The Pledge further down the line. But this is the kind of stuff that Jason, I think we wanted most out of iHeart Originals when we had this idea of making some super premium owned and operated content. And just cannot thank you enough for taking charge of it and delivering some of the best shows in the industry.
Well, thank you. And I have to say, like, this is not something that would have worked outside of iHeart. If it's me on my own, the quality would have been much worse. The support would have been non-existent. The brilliant marketing and PR folks and the publishing team and everyone it's very hard to you have a limited time to get a limited run podcast going and to expertly know where we're going to promote it and which existing shows fans are going to gravitate to. This is an art that this only works inside iHeart. So thank you for all the support that you've given all these shows.
Everybody, thank you so much for hanging out. We will see you again next Thursday around noon Eastern. Be well, take care.
Podversations is a production of iHeartRadio. You can find more from the biggest names in podcasting on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.